o'clock in New York, it's 2 o'clock in London, and it's 6 o'clock in Dubai. But thank you very much for joining us wherever you are. I'm Ed Haig, and this is a summary of findings from part 1 of our strategic planning program for 2014. And I clearly have some latent psychological need to be a newsreader. So we should probably push on. Before we do, we have a hashtag for today's webinar, Consulting 2014. So please use that if you'd like to tweet about anything you're hearing. Before we move on, also I should just say that if you do want to send in questions, please do so using the question sending in thingamabob, which is on the right of your screen, I think. And we'll deal with as many of those as we can. We often run slightly over here, so apologies in advance if we don't get to them, but we'll do our best. If we don't, please send them in to us afterwards. We'd be delighted to answer them. So, moving on. I wanted to show you a nice chart actually first, just because it's new and it's a rather nice chart, but it also helps to explain where the research I'm presenting today fits in. So our research now broadly divides into these 4 areas: consulting market trends, content strategy, client feedback, and growth strategy. The country reports with which many of you will be familiar sit in that consulting markets trend bit, the inner circle of that, which is the subscription part of that. The research I'm presenting today fits within the strategic planning program. It's from part 1 of that, which is all about about global forecasts for the market this year. So it's the subscription part of the growth strategy part of our business. I hope that helps, and I hope you've enjoyed having a little look at that chart. We're rather pleased with it. You can find that on our website, actually, if it's particularly tickled your fancy. So, our research, many of you know that we don't only speak to consulting firms. In the course of our research, we also speak to clients. In the course of researching this particular report, we surveyed 664 clients to get their views. These are senior end users of consulting services. They're the type of people that are using consulting regularly and have used it recently. So their views are very germane to any accurate reading of the consulting market at any time. So hugely based on the input of clients. It's really important to be aware of that. This is not based on simply what consulting firms are telling us, or indeed what we think ourselves. Though of course we use some of that to interpret some of what we hear. So the basic drivers of growth in consulting are fundamentally quite simple, really. Consulting growth comes from the intersection of 2 things. From the activities that clients are undertaking within their organization and the propensity of those clients to use consultants either generally or for a particular project type. So understanding firstly what's happening, or in very simple terms, how much is happening, and how likely people are, for whatever reason, to use consultants is a really critical route to understanding how likely growth is in any period. And here's what we see at the moment. So when we asked clients about this last year, across a very wide range of different activity types, an average of 72% of people said, yes, we will be undertaking this sort of major initiative in the next 12 months. And of those, of the 72%, 45%, that's the blue column to the right, said that will use of consultants. This year, 80% of people are saying that they will be undertaking these initiatives. Again, this is across all initiative types, and I'm going to talk in a minute about which initiatives are most likely. But in other words, the amount that clients are doing has risen. It was already very high, and we spent a lot of our last year talking about just how much clients had on their plate. They have even more on their plate now. They are doing an awful lot. So averaged across all of these different activity types, 80% say we're going to be doing this in the next year. 48%, so an increased amount again from last year, say that's going to lead to consulting work. Now it's really important to understand that this varies quite considerably from one project type to the next, from one geographical region to the next. Some interesting data coming out of the UK in that respect at the moment, actually. And indeed from one organisation to the next. the likeliness to use consultants is impacted by all sorts of things, from the profitability of a company to the attitude of its senior management to the use of consultants, whether it's kind of culturally acceptable. So there are any number of things that impact this. This is the kind of the overview of that, the average of averages, if you like. But it tells us that people are doing more and more likely to use consultants when they do than they were last year. So some good news there. What are they most likely to be doing? Well, more than anything else, they're likely to be working on projects around increasing productivity and improving process efficiency. There's a subtle change here, I think, from what we were seeing at the top previously, which was more simply cost cutting. This idea of increasing productivity and process efficiency now is kind of preeminent, I think, in the minds of many clients. So we've got 92% of people saying that their organisation will be undertaking some sort of major initiative in this respect in the course of the next 12 months. There's cutting costs, 88% saying that they'll be doing cost-cutting initiatives in the next 12 months. So it's still a major part of people's focus, and I think it remains the hallmark of today's consulting industry that both growth and cost-cutting are in focus at the same time. In the past, it tended to be one or the other, but these days both are in focus at the same time. And I know that there are many places around the world where, particularly here in Western Europe actually, I speak from London, and the UK economy is picking up, the UK consulting industry is picking up very nicely. And where you might expect the cost-cutting agenda to be sort of failing a little bit from the priority list, it isn't. It's still absolutely preeminent in so much of what clients are talking about, and remains firmly on the corporate agenda. So we mustn't be kidded into thinking that we've moved into a new phase and that cost-cutting has been forgotten. Improving existing technology, well, 87% of people are saying that they're going to be doing something here in the next 12 months. I think it's fair to say that technology is underpinning just about every type of initiative now, whether that's to do with efficiency, whether it's to do with cost-cutting more specifically, or whether it's to do with growth. There's a sense that technology is really the enabler, the driver of so much of this. And in fact, there's some interesting data we had last year. So this is not this year's data, but last year, some really interesting data in this respect that showed us that clients in Europe expect consultants to have a business-led approach to technology, but that in the US, they expected consultants to have a technology-led approach to business, which I think is almost quite shocking actually to those of us from a European background, but I think is an indication of just how much people there, and I think this probably applies elsewhere as well, which is why I mention it, at least to some degree, understand that advances in business, that their ability to move forward as a business is entirely linked to their access to technology and to advances in technology itself. So technology is really the driver here. I think it's fair to say, though, that just as we look at growth in technology spend and in technology consulting, that the world underneath that is changing quite significantly. So it's pertinent here that we're talking about improving technology. I think there's a sense that what used to be is no longer where technology is concerned. So clients interested in investing in big organization-wide software packages that are designed to last for years and years is on the wane. And what people are much more interested in now is a much more agile approach to technology, a much more democratized, I suppose, approach to technology, much more decentralized, and one that very much takes into account the opportunities presented by new technologies. We hear a huge amount of people talking not only about digitization generally, but about social media specifically and about cloud and mobile technologies. So there are very few conversations with clients at the moment that don't involve technology in some respect. And then lastly, of these kind of most likely to be doing, and our report goes into a lot more detail about all the initiatives, but is this sense that clients are still looking for opportunities to exploit opportunities for growth. So 85% of people saying they're going to be doing something around growth. And again, you know, this cost-cutting and growth thing seems to be quite interchangeable at the moment. You'll speak to one group of people and they'll say growth is more important than cost-cutting, and another group will say vice versa. The reality is that they're both very much in focus. There's not a huge difference in the numbers doing any of these types of projects. So all of this is where the biggest focus is right now. If we then turn to what they're most likely to use consultants for, well, here we see a slightly different picture. So actually the highest proportion of people, 52%, say that they're likely to use consultants for M&A projects. I should be clear here. This is 52% of people who say they will be doing M&A related work, say that it will lead to the use of consultants. So M&A didn't feature on that previous list. It's not one of the things that clients are most likely to be doing. But when they do, it's very likely to lead to consulting work. And I think that, you know, that won't surprise anyone. There's a pretty well-established link here between the deals market and consulting work, and indeed the likes of the Big Four will benefit very significantly from that, based on the position of their businesses. So M&A, the most obvious driver of the use of consulting. Then there's transformation, which I'm reminded as I pop it up is equally likely, 52%. Know your slide, Ed. Transformation. You know, this is a term that we've heard a huge amount over the last few years, and as I think we've said in the past, we were initially quite dismissive of it. Not that it was a new term, but just that suddenly it seemed to be in vogue. A bit worried that it might be consulting speak, but clients are speaking about it as much as consultants. And indeed, it's our belief that this is where a very, very large amount of growth in the consulting industry is coming from at the moment. Indeed, last year we estimated that somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of all growth in consulting globally came from transformation projects. And I'm increasingly speaking to consulting firms who say we have to have these projects. This is the determinant, really, the key determinant in terms of whether we are successful or not in any given year. We're happy to have smaller projects at the same time, but what we need are these big transformation initiatives. I had an interesting conversation with someone recently in Scandinavia. I think it was in Denmark, actually, asking him about transformation projects. And everyone's got their opinion about transformation and what it means exactly. But I think he explained it particularly succinctly, and I'll try to do the same, by saying that, of course, organizations these days everything's connected. It's very hard to change one thing without it having an implication, without it having an impact for everything else in an organization. In fact, he said it's a bit like having a master data set, and when you tweak something somewhere, its implications are felt throughout your whole data environment. And I think that just really kind of held water for me, that idea that organizations are now so integrated and so much is connected that you simply can't change anything without changing everything else. And I think there are a lot of clients now who recognize that and are understanding that an initiative in a discrete part of their organization is going to end up leading to other work, and that perhaps they ought to kind of roll all of these issues up at the start and approach this as a transformation project. That doesn't happen all the time. So something like, and this is very rough, but about 50% of transformation projects are conceived as a transformation project. And the other half start life as some smaller initiative within a particular function of the business, most typically in operations, occasionally in HR, though not so often, sometimes in marketing, and get rolled up. So they come from different places, but there's this real sense that you now get, and indeed that it's quite hard to avoid these much bigger transformation projects than it was in the past. And they're very likely to lead to the use of consultants because they tend to be big projects, they tend to be multi-geographical, they tend to be multifunctional, and they require an external viewpoint. Something major, pretty significant is happening to an organization here. It is fundamentally transforming what it is and what it does, and that just requires external input. So we could talk about transformation for some time, and indeed I probably have just done, but we'll leave it there for now. I think I'll talk about a little more when we do our UK webinar a little later on today. Improving existing technology is also high. Excuse me, folks. Minor technical error. I'll just pull that slide back. So, improving existing technology, equally likely to lead to the use of consultants. And I think, again, like M&A, this is a really well-established link, actually. I think there's been an understanding for many years that technology requires external input, and it's continuing to do so. So it's a very strong driver of consulting at the moment. And lastly, this issue of increasing productivity and improving process efficiency, which only slightly fewer people are saying is likely to lead to the use of consultants. So these are the things they're most likely to use consultants for. It's interesting to know here that growth doesn't feature, at least at the moment. Slightly fewer people who are undertaking growth-related projects say that's going to lead to the use of consultants in some way. There are many potential reasons for that, but I think this speaks a little bit to the sense that consultants have tended to be associated in recent years with back office work, with the back office environment, and perhaps less so with front office work, and a sense amongst clients that they're not quite sure how consultants play in, behave in that front office environment anymore. So fewer of the people saying that they're doing growth-related work, saying that's going to lead to consulting work. I just want to, before I move on here as well, mention very briefly regulation, because although that wasn't mentioned on the previous chart, it is something that an awful lot of people are expecting to have work driven by, to be doing work around regulation. And obviously, this is particularly pertinent in the financial services sector right now. Something like 80% of people expect to be doing some sort of regulatory-driven initiative in the next 12 months. But fewer of them are saying that's driving consulting work, and that's an interesting one, because I think the link there in recent years has been incredibly strong. There's almost nothing that's been a more clear driver of consulting work than regulation. And it's a little early to say whether that's part of an ongoing trend, but I think it's a little worrying for anyone that understands just how important the financial services sector is to the industry, and just how much of a driver regulation is within that sector. That there seems to be a slightly lessening propensity to use consultants to help there. So we're going to keep watching that one. I don't think we should panic too much about it at first, but there's just the early signs of something that it might be worth thinking about there. In terms of how that picture sort of maps out across different sectors, we haven't got a huge amount of time left, so I won't dwell too much on each sector. And things are quite different. So here again, I'm looking at these basic drivers. So the extent to which organisations expect to be undertaking activities across the board, and the extent to which they expect to use consultants when they do. So all the good news happens in the top right-hand corner of this chart. Those are those are the sectors that are both doing more and more likely to use consultants when they do. So there we find retail, for example, which has been a really strong growth area over the course of 2013, and which looks set to continue to grow really well. A lot of work going on there around multi-channel, and organisations just generally trying to address the need to catch up with the likes of Amazon. I'm talking here about more traditional offline retailers. And I think it's always particularly pertinent conversation at this time of year after Christmas sales figures have come out, and we're reminded once again just how much consumer spending has shifted into the online environment. And there's this real sort of puts the wind in the sails of retailers. So lots going on there, and very likely to drive consulting work. Financial services, well, I mentioned that briefly a minute ago. Obviously, a lot of regulation still going on here, a lot of remediation work as well, which is interesting stuff. It's a big opportunity, but it's one that not all consulting firms are totally comfortable about taking on. I think there are concerns there about the potential impact on brand. And there's also a sense that it's quite low-value, commoditized work as well. So I know that some firms are quite deliberately staying away from getting too involved in remediation. Others I know are embracing the opportunity, and I think of some examples in particular, but sort of depends on where you sit. But definitely a lot going on there. But a big focus too in financial services on the customer more generally. I think there's a real sense that's the kind of end focus for a lot of organisations right now. The customer. How do we engage with them? How do we access them through the multi-channel environment? How do we build propositions for them? And what do they mean to us in our newly transformed state? And indeed, a lot of this leading to transformation itself in the financial services sector. Public sector, we're slightly curious to see it where it is actually, because in a sense you might expect that there's an awful lot going on in the public sector, but not much likelihood that they would use consultants because of the sensitivities in doing so. In fact, what the data at the moment is telling us is the opposite, that there's not a huge amount going on, but that where there are things happening, there's a lot of willingness to use consultants. I do find that a little curious. I think it perhaps speaks to the phase that we're in terms of public sector expenditure on consultants. In that consultants, certainly in places like the UK, were largely kind of booted out of the public sector, and perhaps there is now more of a willingness to bring them back in. But of course we have to be very careful here, because the picture in the public sector varies considerably from one country to the next. So it's a little hard to be to sort of generalise here. The energy sector, picking that one up for a minute, feels a little over-consulted. This is where there were an awful lot of opportunities not so long ago, really one of the growth sectors, certainly when we were looking at this back in 2012. Feels a little over-consulted right now. We speak to a lot of organisations who are saying they're trying to cut back on their use of consultants. Where there is work, a lot going on around productivity at the moment, and again, quite a lot of transformation work. Then we have services, which is a little bit of a mixed bag, really, and quite a static environment at the moment. Although, interestingly enough, there's quite a lot going on around professional services right now. We hear quite a lot of kind of transformation activity going on in law firms, for example. But, you know, generally quite a static sector at the moment, and a very mixed one. Technology, media, and telecoms. Well, there's an awful lot going on here. 97% of organisations within technology, media, and telecoms, and I appreciate that's kind of a few sectors rolled into one, say they're working on some sort of growth-related initiative in the next 12 months. 97%. They're also much more concerned about culture change than other organisations at the moment. It's a really strong focus there, but not necessarily as likely to use consultants as those in the retail financial services sectors, for example. A little bit of a sense there of trying to do things in-house a bit more. Pharma, well, loads going on here. It's hard to find a sector in which there's more happening, but I think work in the pharma sector is going to be pretty hard won in 2014. There's a real sense that across a wide variety of different project types, clients are less likely to want to use consultants than they are elsewhere. So you have to work pretty hard to win activity here. And I think very active procurement departments here. I think there will be a lot of success for some firms and very little for others. I think you'll get quite a lot concentrated in the hands of relatively few firms. Manufacturing, well, this is the sector that largely pulled the industry out of recession after sort of 2008, 2009, with its focus on growth and on emerging markets. But there's much more of a focus now on efficiency and productivity within the manufacturing sector, and that's the sort of thing that manufacturers tend to believe that they can do themselves in-house. So they're a bit less likely to turn to consultants to help with that. Health, a little bit of over-optimism here, I think. I think there's a lot of people getting quite excited about health, and quite understandably so. I think in places like the US and the UK, that there are quite clearly a lot of potential drivers of consulting work here. But actually, we don't always see that translating into action. They're not as likely to turn to consultants for help, particularly interestingly enough around technology. Far less likely in the healthcare sector to use consultants to help with technology. There could be something here about them using vendors directly. So don't forget that when we talk about technology, we're talking about IT consulting, the advisory part, if you like, rather than systems implementation. And there may be a desire, particularly amongst publicly owned healthcare providers, to try to kind of cut out that bit and to take advice from the vendors themselves, which of course is very often given away for free. So there may be some corners being cut. I'm not convinced that technology isn't a big part of what's going on in healthcare, but it's not turning up at the moment as consulting spend. So what a varied picture, and I appreciate this is a very kind of generalized chart. I didn't want to kind of get into too much specifics. We go into an awful lot of detail around each of these in our report, really examining the drivers and giving you much more accurate sense of how each sector compares with the others. But I think for today's purposes, it's just kind of useful to get a sense of roughly how things compare. And lastly, I just wanted to kind of put a slightly provocative question out there. Is your consulting firm really necessary? Some of you might have seen a blog by my colleague Fiona about this recently. So this chart tells us the extent to which people expect their spend on consultants to change in terms of the different reasons for using consultants. So we see, for example, that for specialist skills not available in-house, 44% of people are saying spend's going to increase for using consultants in that way. 46% saying it's staying the same, 10% saying that they think it's going to shrink. And we have these different types of usage: additional capacity when we're busy, help in implementing large-scale projects, and then help in devising and planning large-scale projects, help responding to regulatory change, and for independent input and validation. I kind of want to look at this in this way. Those are two different groups. One of those groups, and notably all the things at the top of this chart, are actually about individuals. When people are talking about specialist skills, when they're talking about additional capacity, when they're talking about help for implementing large-scale projects, they're talking about using individuals rather than firms. The firm really isn't as important here as the individual. And these issues down the bottom, help in devising large-scale projects, devising rather than implementing, responding to regulatory change, input, independent input and validation of things that clients are already working on. That's very much about the firm, and it's really notable, I think, that things related to individuals seem to be much more likely to grow than things where a firm is required, where what the client is really buying is corporate consulting, is a consulting firm. And in fact, that's borne out by a question we asked more directly on this subject, which showed that actually the proportion expecting spend on individuals to increase is twice that expect it to increase, to spend on firms to increase. So a really notable thing here, we have to be really aware that just as we talk about this being a pretty positive picture in the consulting market at the moment, there are a lot of questions to be asked about exactly what the nature of that growth is. And very important, I think, that firms start to find a way to articulate the value that they can add beyond what the individual can do. And clients, interestingly enough, tell us something about this themselves. So they talk about firms being able to field genuine experts, for example. This sense of one client, for instance, recently said to us, I got on the phone to the consultant at the beginning of the day, and by the end of the day, they'd assembled a team from right around the world. This real sense that firms have access to this global network and can find genuine experts anywhere. I think very importantly at the moment as well is the sense that firms can be held accountable for results, and that's massively important to clients right now. Something that they talk about an awful lot, and something that of course they struggle to hold individuals to. And perhaps lastly, and slightly ironically, I think there's a sense that firms are actually quite good at answering the need for a flexible resourcing model. I appreciate the irony in that when we're talking about needing to respond to this demand for individuals. But the truth is that firms tend to be able to provide resources based on who's best rather than on who's simply available, which is much more what you would get from the kind of interim contingent labour market. But I think it's really important that firms do understand both that in many cases it's individuals that clients are after at the moment, and not a firm itself, and that they really think about how they articulate the value. They really think about what value that they're bringing to this piece. So I hope that's a useful overview. Of course, there's a huge amount of detail on all of that in the report itself. We don't really have time, I'm afraid, for questions. I'm sure there are some coming in. I will check with my colleague, but if they haven't, well, they're not going to be answered actually. So do email us. We'd love to hear from you, and we're quite happy to chat about this stuff any time, either by email or over the phone. So please send them in. And if you want to know anything more about this report specifically, or indeed about anything on that lovely new chart of ours, please contact Sarah Burgess. There's her email address and phone number there, and I expect she's probably been tweeting quite actively throughout the course of this webinar. So that's it from me for today, at least for the next half hour. We're doing a UK webinar in half an hour, so if you haven't signed up for that yet and fancy listening in on the UK situation, please do so. I won't be repeating too much, I promise, but I might be repeating a bit. Otherwise, thanks very much for joining us, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.